to record. So welcome everyone. So great that you can all be here and great to see everyone. I am excited. We have a lot to cover in our third Dutchess CAPI cohort meeting. Quickly to go over the agenda, Caroline, if you all haven't met Caroline Dickey is with ICLEI, and she is going to be leading us through the ICLEI Excel workbook. This is a data workbook that if you all haven't worked with yet, you will be soon. It is very helpful for inputting data prior to inputting data into ClearPath. So it's aligned with ClearPath, so it should greatly facilitate the ClearPath data entry process. And just in case you haven't seen it yet, you can find this Excel workbook on the Dutchess CAPI website under Shared Resources, Program Resources, or in your SharePoint folder. After that, I'm going to be covering some questions that have come up in the last few months and provide some answers. Then Kale will be discussing climate communications, so how to effectively communicate your data. This is mainly directed at those of you who are not specifically working on gathering the data, but are more focused on researching and writing the greenhouse gas report. Then we're going to break out into breakout rooms for 15 minutes, where we're going to be discussing how things are going. This is a great time to ask questions to your fellow cohort members, discuss any roadblocks that have come up and how you're working through them or have not overcome them yet, what you've learned, as well as what you're hoping to get out of this process. So Kale and Caroline and I will each be hosting one of those breakout rooms, and I will be splitting you up by municipality. And then we'll close out. I'll cover next steps and homework and a few reminders. Spoiler alert, please remember to fill in your hours and your match tracking document in SharePoint. Okay, so now I will hand it over to Caroline.
Great, thank you. I'll just take a moment to share my screen. Oh, I think I need hostability.
Yeah, I just did it, so hopefully you'll know.
Great. Okay. Oops, sorry, I have a lot going on today. A lot of tabs open. So I'm going to start in the data workbook, and I can't see chat, so if there are any questions, if Mary or Kale could jump in, or if anyone just wants to unmute themselves and interrupt me, please do. This can be a little bit overwhelming, as some of you may know after looking at it, if you have already. So I'm going to try to walk you through it, and yeah, I'll try to leave a lot of time for questions so that we can kind of, get through it quicker and get to what's important for you all. So starting off in the first tab, this is just the introduction and data checklist tab. So this is a good place to kind of orient yourself with the entire spreadsheet. It's a good place for anyone that you share it with to orient themselves. You'll put your information in here just so that anyone in the future looking at this workbook knows, who filled it out and how to contact them if they have any questions. And the key things on this really are just, there are links to all of the other tabs. So if you want to start here and read the description over in this e-column for each tab, that can be helpful for some. And then, yeah, all of these are linked. So if you just click on one of them, it'll direct you to the other tab. I think that's kind of it for this tab. Are there any? Oh, and I wanted to call out, there's this additional sources box up here, which has 3 links. One is to the protocol. So if you have a question and want to refer to that, you can easily get to it in your workbook. Same with the ClearPath login. And what's the third one? Oh, and then the ICLEI community. So some of those online training resources, again, if you have questions, a great place to go. And every tab does have sort of an introduction like this one and other boxes with information. So would definitely recommend reading through those before you start working in a tab, because it definitely helps orient you and tells you what the key information you need to know in order to fill out that tab correctly. Are there any questions on this Introduction and Data Checklist tab? Okay, I'm gonna move on because I wasn't expecting many questions with this one. The next one is the Data Collection Tracking tab. I definitely use this one the most. I find it extremely helpful for just organizing yourself. So basically it's set up so we have your factor sets and then your activity data. And all the columns are the same for those two groups of data points. I think of the description, status, and next steps as really just for you to use in order to track where you're at with data collection and entering. And then the rest is more to gather the information on who to contact and the organization and the contact information for where you're getting that data. So for example, Central Hudson, I think is your electricity provider. So you'd put in organization, Central Hudson, the contact name, and then their information. You could add any notes, and you could even include like hard to get this data, had to work with them, took longer, just so that people in the future know maybe they should ask for that data sooner rather than later. And then, yeah, this description, status, and next steps is really what I use the most. So in description, you might highlight for your factor sets. This could be like your utility factor set. So Central Hudson has their own emissions factor for the electricity that they provide to you. You might want to put Central Hudson in the description, and then you can use the status for whether or not you've collected the data, if you've just requested it, if it's not available, etc. And I think we will go into factor sets a little bit more in a moment. I think there are some defaults in ClearPath for those. So this factor sets portion of the data collection tab may be a little less important than, say, the activity data portion, because this is really, this is where you're organizing all of the data that you're collecting, which there is a lot of entities, as you can see. So that status tab, I think, is really the most helpful here. And then one thing to note, you do have to scroll over, but there is a little color key over here. And so for activity data, I find that really helpful. All of the green highlighted cells are the required activity data that you have to request and enter for your inventory. And then the gray are the optional, which are mostly scope 3. Yeah, are there any questions on this tab? Oh yes, this was a good question actually to get us started. One of the communities asked where concrete and construction materials or asphalt for road paving, where would that type of data go? And so that's actually optional unless the climate smarts communities require that. Mary, maybe jump in if that is required. I'm kind of assuming it's not because it's scope 3. And so that would go under your consumption-based emissions. And you certainly could input that if you'd like to, and if you have that data available. Yeah,
that's right, Caroline. It is not required. It is considered scope 3.
Great. Yeah, I would have been a little surprised, but it is definitely a good one to keep track of because concrete is more emissions intensive, and so is asphalt. So.
How about the low emissions concrete? We started using that in a lot of our projects.
Great. Are you wondering where it's like how to include that, or is there a question?
Let's say yes.
Okay. Yeah. So that would be under your consumption-based emissions under. Pretty sure that, yeah, so there's a construction materials consumption at the very bottom, and so you could input it there. And then ClearPath does have a calculator for that.
Thank you.
So one thing to keep in mind, Liz, sorry if I could just jump in here, Caroline, is that
That was great.
we are completing this inventory for 2019 as a baseline year. So if you
We
do
didn't
it,
have it.
if you didn't have it then it probably wouldn't be relevant. But you could note it. You could note that there are high emissions associated with concrete. So then when you update the inventory, you can address that by saying that you have been working with low embodied concrete in future years.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and just to add to that, if you weren't using it in 2019 or you were using less of it compared to just normal concrete, then including it in your inventory in 2019 could be beneficial, because then your future inventories can show how much of an impact that change made. So those are really the things to think about when considering the optional emissions.
So we want to keep track of how many square feet, how many miles of curb. We've been using it for a bunch of stuff.
Yeah, I need to double check the calculator. I haven't actually worked with that one yet personally.
Not that I want more math. I'm already overwhelmed with
Yeah.
what we have. So that might be a next level kind of a thing. Mary knows that we're having fun with this. But yeah, just as a point of interest. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll double check that. And it's great that you're even thinking about that. Most communities are only, just even starting to understand consumption-based emissions. So that's great.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, please.
If we have solar panels on any of our municipal properties, is that entered in anywhere?
Yes, so I was going to get to that under the buildings and
Okay.
facilities tab, just so that we can talk about it with electricity, but yeah, I can also just jump ahead to that one if we're ready, unless there are other questions about this kind of overarching sheet. Okay, yeah, let's move on to buildings and facilities. So this is going to be what every tab of where you enter the data looks like. And again, like I mentioned earlier, it's going to have that instructions box at the top, which would recommend reading. And there's always going to be links back to the other tabs, like this back to intro at the top as well. And so this is where you start to enter your data. It can look like a lot. I'm not going to lie, so please jump in if you have questions about all of this. A lot of the tabs start to look the same, so I'll probably go faster after we go through one, but just to orient yourselves a little bit more with this, there's always going to be a record name column, and that's the first one you're going to input. I just put what ICLEI uses for our inventories. We kind of came up with a standard for these record names. We like to do sectors, that would be buildings and facilities. The source, if that's your electricity utility, it would be, I think, Con Ed for you. I might be wrong about that. But yeah, so it'd be buildings and electricity, or buildings and facilities, Con Ed, and then electricity. And then the same for natural gas. It would just be buildings and facilities, whatever your natural gas utility is, and then natural gas. But please do whatever naming convention works best for you and makes the most sense to you. Just one way to keep it organized. And then you're going to you start doing the data entry part. So in terms of electricity, that's typically going to be kilowatt hours or megawatt hours, which you'll pull from a data request sheet that you received your response in. I do have examples, so I could pull one of those up. Yeah, so this was actually one of your communities. I figured that would be easiest. I did notice a couple things when I was looking at this just at first glance. I'll zoom in a little bit. Okay, so I noticed that it's important to pay attention to your service type if you have a request sheet that looks like this, because electric is kind of mixed in with gas. So when you're totaling up the electricity for each account, just make sure you're not pulling the gas numbers. So one way to do it, and I kind of do everything in Excel because I'm a technical person and that's kind of, where I'm working most of the time. So I was just going to total up the electricity from this data sheet in Excel, in the Excel workbook that I received from them. And yeah, again, just make sure you are skipping the gas as you're going through this. And so really all you do from this is pull this 40,695 number and put it into electricity used. And then you can select your units. So typically it's going to be reported in kilowatt hours or megawatt hours. If you need to write in a different unit, you certainly can. I think all of the units in the workbook are the ones in ClearPath. So if you don't convert it for this spreadsheet, you will probably have to convert it for ClearPath. So just a heads up on that. And also with units and these drop-down menus, if for some reason a little section doesn't have these drop-down menus, you can go to the bottom and you'll see these various, they're just kind of lists because they're used to create those drop-down menus, but they are helpful to refer to if you're not sure which unit you should be looking for or which fuel type you can put into ClearPath. So that's definitely a helpful part at the bottom. So just to keep going, there are some optional points of data entry. These, are helpful to have for tracking purposes and for understanding how your occupancy impacts the data or your operating hours and how those might allow you to make improvements. But they are optional and, really dependent on the data that you're able to collect. And then for each entry, there will always be a notes column as well for you to just add anything. Maybe like assumptions are a good thing to put here, or any of your conversion calculations. It's good to keep track of that so that whoever checks your inventory can see what you did. Yeah, and then there's more information. There's a ton of information at the end of each data type of record. These boxes, there is this ClearPath entry, so it'll tell you which calculator you'll be using under which sector, and it'll link you back to the factor sets and parameters tab if there is a factor set you need for that, which I will go over next. And so the rest of this tab is just going to be your stationary fuel combustion. So that'll most likely be natural gas. If you have any fuel oil or propane, all of that will go under this emissions from stationary fuel combustion. And it's really the same thing. You'll do your record name, you'll select the fuel type in this case, and then you'll do, again, that number of fuel use that you take from your data request response, and then select the units. And yeah, pretty much all the same. One thing I wanted to note, there are a lot of extra records or type of records that you may be entering. I don't believe any of your communities have these, like a steam and district heating plant, or this electric power transmission and distribution losses. This is optional at scope 3. District cooling. Yeah, I believe you all don't have this, but if you do, so if you don't have this, you should just ignore those rows and don't worry about them. But if you do, fill them out and let us know if you have any questions related to those. And then, yeah, I was going to address the solar question. So if you have any rooftop solar or any other renewable energy facilities, those actually, assuming you are consuming that electricity, you don't input it anywhere into ClearPath or your inventory unless you wanted to account for, the life cycle emissions associated with those, but that would be optional. And yeah, that's just because they don't have, they're not adding any emissions. So your electricity is accounting for it. It's just sort of hidden because that electricity would have been subtracted out of what you had to purchase from the utility. Does that make a little more sense? Vanessa, I know you asked that question, so let me know if that helps.
Yeah, thank you.
Of course. And I also wanted to say, I think that's a really good opportunity to add some storytelling to your inventory report when you're going over the electricity and kind of summarizing that information, just saying we added solar and it produced this number of kilowatt hours. Our building consumed this much, so we did have some clean electricity there. I'm going to go into factor sets and parameters next. Are there any other questions about the buildings and facilities tab? Okay, great. I'm going to keep going. Just jump in if there is anything. So for factor sets and parameters, there may be a lot of questions about this one. We do have, well, before I jump into that, so inventory parameters, I know there are some questions on. I'll zoom in a little bit. Well, so this inventory parameters, you do have to enter some of this data to start your inventory in ClearPath. So I think starting to collect it in here is a good idea, just to, you're doing that for all of the other data, no reason not to for this. And so ClearPath has to have the year. So that would be 2019. It's the year of the inventory, not the year you're creating it. So that would be 2019. And then it should have your 2019 population. ClearPath does not actually need GDP or currency, but kind of like some of that other optional information I've mentioned, it can help. ClearPath can do some calculations with that information. It would be extra information. So if you can add that, it's helpful, but it's not necessary. And then global warming potential, I definitely wanted to talk about this one. ClearPath will automatically have this IPCC 5th assessment report, and that is the correct one. As it says here, it's recommended. Yeah, there's really no reason that I can think of to use older assessment values, and this 20-year values is also just not generally recommended. The 100-year values 5th assessment report are kind of the standard right now. Yes, that's it for inventory parameters, and then we can get into the factor sets. So again, there are these instructions that will provide a little bit of clarity on this page, including the factor sets. We do list some resources for default emissions factors, but all of these should actually already be in ClearPath, the defaults. So then we get into the actual factor sets, and the defaults are the backup. If your community has a transportation factor set because you've done some calculations on that, you could use your own. We use Google EIE now, and that data is Environmental Insights Explorer from Google, I should say, and that data is pretty accurate and good. So you really don't need the transportation factor set on your end, but if you have it, also good to compare or good to use, and you could input that data here. And then I did want to mention too that with factor sets, if you wanted to, you could go into ClearPath and copy the default information from ClearPath into into this tab. So I just wanted to show real quick. I know we'll go into ClearPath more later, but if you're ahead of the game, you could check this out. And so there's this factor sets tab at the top here, and all of your factor sets will show up. You can see when I click on transportation, all of the defaults pop up. And so you would just scroll all the way down and find 2019, and you could just copy this over into your workbook so that people in the future know what data you were using for those factor sets and where you got it from. And you can do that for, there's a lot. So you can do that for waste characterization and electricity as well. So just wanted-
Caroline, it might
Oh,
be
yeah.
helpful, just a quick question. If you could define factor sets for those who might not know exactly what factor sets are.
Yes, of course. Sorry, I get lost in the kind of inventory mode and don't think about things like that. So factor sets are going to be used on the back end in ClearPath for the calculation. So for transportation, for example, it'll include the miles per gallon. So you want to multiply your fuel economy by, I'm trying to think of the calculations on the spot, but all of that information is just incorporated into the calculation on the back end of ClearPath so that it can account for things like fuel economy, or in terms of waste characterization, it can account for how much of your waste is cardboard versus food versus grass. And so all of that just kind of impacts the actual emissions output based on the type of waste or the type of vehicle and how emissions intense those are.
Are those like standard assumptions in some way then? They're like the multiplier? I guess I'm not understanding factor sets. They're like the assumption that you're making that this is the multiplier of how you would calculate something.
Yes. Yeah. And so they're assumptions if you use the defaults. And it's totally okay to use the defaults, very normal because it's hard to get this data. But for example, if your landfill did a waste characterization study and knows the exact percentage of cardboard versus newspaper, then it's less of an assumption and more, more of an exact factor. Does that make more sense?
Yeah, so then I guess what was that other sheet that we were just looking at where you were kind of pulling for 2019, where you had different years and there was.
So that's in ClearPath. And so I know we
Okay.
haven't gotten into that. I just wanted to give you all a heads up that these factor sets, some of them are in ClearPath, and you could later on, once you're working ClearPath, you could pull that information into the factor sets tab here.
Carolyn,
Mhm.
this is Rich Levine. So the gas passenger vehicle, for the passenger vehicles that the town has, you're putting in an average MPG? Or do you do it by vehicle?
Yeah, you do an average if you have that data.
Okay,
Yeah, so it'd be an average of all of your gas passenger vehicles, an average of all of your light truck fuel vehicles. And
but
so-
ClearPath gave you a factor, gave you a miles per gallon. Is that something we input?
So you won't need to in ClearPath because all of this is the transportation factor sets are already there. So they're just easy to pull. As you can see, we have a lot of different ones, a lot of different years. So you just have to find the correct year.
Okay, but it doesn't do it by vehicle type or vehicle, whether it's a big car or a little car,
It actually does. So that's one of the benefits of using ClearPath is that we have these factor sets ready to go for you. So it's actually the same exact list. You can see we have gas passenger vehicle, gas light truck, gas heavy
Yeah,
truck.
okay.
Yeah, so it's the exact same list.
All right.
And my question is, why does the miles per gallon? Oh, never mind. It's going up. I thought never mind. The emissions were going up.
And then the vehicle, the CH4 and N2O. How do we input that? Or is that just calculated from what we input?
So that's already in the factor sets
Okay,
as well. You can see the
Okay.
grams CH4, grams N2O.
so we don't input that. That calculates it from the vehicle economy.
Yes,
Mm.
unless you have that data.
I don't know
Right.
how we have that.
Yeah. Yeah,
Okay.
it's unusual that communities do, but some do. So I just,
So
just
unless we want to do a lot of math,
yeah.
Okay.
is
Got
what
it.
I'm hearing. Okay.
Thank you.
Any other questions on factor sets and parameters?
I have a question. Let's pretend I'm doing the waste characterization. And we have a food composting program, so that I'm not really sure. Where does that figure in?
So composting actually does not need a factor set because it's treated separately from solid waste.
Okay,
So this food, grass, and leaves is really just, if you don't have compost and your solid waste facility mixes all of that in with the rest of their waste.
okay.
Yeah, I know the factor sets are probably one of the more confusing pieces to this. I do think they'll make more sense once we're working more in ClearPath. And just please reach out if you have any questions, especially regarding factor sets that you may have, or if you have any further questions on them at all.
Okay.
But the waste characterization, that's just if you own or operate a municipal landfill. That's not for like accounting for the waste that is generated and like hauled away by a hauler. Is that correct?
So waste characterization does apply to any waste that's generated. And so this one can be tricky. If you own a landfill and you have the waste characterization from that landfill, that's great, include it for sure. That's not super common. So then there are a few other points of resources for this. And I think Mary and I have talked about this a little bit, and we can definitely help more on this one. But basically we jump up in terms of, what's ideal to have. So ideally you have the landfill waste characterization study. If we don't have that, we jump to community levels. That would be if your local government has done a waste characterization for your community. If that's not available, then you try to find county level data, because sometimes counties collect that. And then sometimes states. So, it kind of is a spiraling effect of trying to find the best data you can. But in the end, there's always a default. So it's not, we'll figure it out and help you if you can't find that data. Any more questions on this one? Okay, I think we should probably keep moving just for time's sake. We're getting to the end of my time for today. So streetlights and traffic signals, this is, I don't know, I feel like once you start to work in other tabs, they all get more and more straightforward. It's fairly similar to the building electricity and stationary combustion. You'll just do the record name, the total number of kilowatt hours that were consumed. The units is going to be the kilowatt hours versus megawatt hours, and then number of streetlights. And so Mary and I and Kale were talking yesterday. There are a few options for how you might input this data. So I'm going to actually pull up an example so that I can show you. So this is also from one of your communities. And I want to make sure y'all can read it. So hopefully this will look similar for most of you, but you'll have the type of light over here. So that's the size. That would be like a 25 watt. I'm pretty sure it doesn't specify, but I would assume it's a 25 watt LED. And then this community owns 542 of that size. And so you could input the data into your workbook based on either type. So you could have one record that is for all of the sodium vapor lamps that your community has, and then you would just total up the kilowatt hours from just those 4. And then you could do the same for the LEDs and keep that separate and total up those kilowatt hours for that. You could go line by line and do 1 entry per type of lamp. I think that is something that your community should decide, you know, what you have the capacity for, what you have the time for, what's important. Like this community that already has all of these LEDs may not need to worry so much about doing line by line entries because they already have LEDs. That's great. That's the most efficient option out there. Not a ton you can do in terms of emissions mitigation. So that's kind of what I wanted to speak to on that. And then I did notice there's some streetlights are powered by combustion of natural gas. I think that's pretty uncommon these days, but if your community does have that, you can input that on this tab as well. This electric power transmission and distribution losses, this is going to be optional scope 3, like many of the records in here. And you can always refer to your data collection tracking sheet for, you know, what's gray on here versus what's not. I thought I would be, oh, there it is. Well, yeah. Any questions on streetlights and traffic signals? Okay, I'm gonna keep going. Okay, so fleet, this is a good one for us to get to today. Or actually, yeah, it's pretty similar to the rest. You'll have your instructions at the top and then the boxes for where you're going to enter data for the various calculators. And so fleet vehicle is just going to be essentially the, you know, gas versus diesel or other fuels you might use. You can input electricity. So that's, you know, if you have any electric vehicles, they can go on here, which is great. You'll just input the fuel use and then the units again. I did want to call out this % biofuel in blend. So this only applies if you're entering a record for ethanol or biodiesel. So I'm guessing that's pretty uncommon, so I wouldn't worry about that, but yeah, just a heads up on that front. Yeah, I think vehicle miles traveled and % are fairly straightforward. There's an off-road vehicles portion, so this is where you would put like your lawnmowers, your golf carts, anything more unusual like that, that's not an on-road vehicle. If you own public transit, that's where all of those records would go, and they're really
Also,
all.
Carolyn, sorry, just to chime in, leaf blowers, those also go in with the lawn equipment as well, right?
Yes, they do.
Okay.
Thank you for calling that out. Yeah, leaf blowers, anything that moves but doesn't move on a road. That's how I like to think of it. So like leaf blowers or lawnmowers.
Excavators?
Yes, yes, those would be off-road. And that would be, there is this equipment type, so you can choose construction. And so that will pull the right, factors associated with those heavier vehicles. There's even aircraft. Your
They didn't
small
get-
utility might be things like your lawnmowers and your gas blower, or your leaf blowers, sorry. Yeah, any other questions on this? Okay, great. I'm gonna keep moving because we're running out of time. So then there's employee commute. This one is a little more challenging, I think. So we might need to go over this at a future date or maybe in office hours. The survey is very helpful, and you can actually put all of the survey information at the bottom here. And so I wanted to definitely call out this part because you can just copy over a lot of that data. Anything that's gray here shouldn't be touched unless you have a reason to, like say you're accounting for school employees and they don't work 52 weeks in a year, you might need to change that. But these are kind of the standard assumptions that ICLEI uses. And so you'll input that data, and then we do have some formulas in here to help you with those calculations. Yeah, so that's a good place to put all of your survey data as you get it. And I would start there on this tab actually, because once you have all that data down there, you can start to figure out where you're going to put, like the vehicle miles traveled that you total up after working with that survey. Same with the fuel type. I think there was, yes, does ClearPath have some calculation for electric vehicles? It does, so you can select electric to put in a record for all of your electric vehicles. And this one you will have more records for, because you'll want one for gasoline, one for diesel, and then one for electric if your employees have electric vehicles. There is even ethanol. I think ClearPath also has biodiesel if anybody uses that. So lots of options. I think that'll make sense. And then there is transit use. You can calculate that based on the survey.
And there's a sample employee survey somewhere, I thought I saw, right?
Yes, I believe maybe Mary can speak to where it is for you.
Yes, it's in the shared resources on the CAPI website.
I thought I saw it. Okay, thank you.
Oh, and there was one other question too. It was, yeah, so for people who walk, that's kind of similar to your on-site or rooftop solar. They don't generate any emissions, so they're not included from the data, or the direct entry aspect. But that's also a piece that I would recommend adding to your storytelling, saying, this many people drove to work and accounted for this many emissions, but we had this many people walking. Yeah, and that's also a good thing to track, so that you know how many people start to walk more versus how many commute by car or public transit. I'm kind of assuming none of you are accounting for employee air travel, but if you wanted to, you could add that in here. That is an optional scope 3 item, unless somebody flies to their office, but I can't imagine that happens very often. Any questions on this tab?
Caroline, for the electric vehicles, so there's some data factor that accounts for like the emissions associated with generating the electricity for the electric vehicle. Is that why we're tracking electric vehicles?
Yes. So when you input that into ClearPath, there will be an option to select your factor set again, and you'll just select whatever factor set you're using for your electricity entries. And then you'll also have to make sure, I know that the defaults for the transportation, they don't actually have an electric vehicle factor. So I did this recently. I just took all of the employees from a survey that I was working on. I just took all of their miles per gallon, because they report that in the survey for their electric vehicle. And I did use some US averages for electric vehicles, calculated an average for all of those and put that in my factor set so that it would calculate in ClearPath. And we may need to come back to that when we go into the ClearPath stuff, but hopefully that makes more sense now. Any other questions on employee commute? Okay, let's go into wastewater. And Mary and Kale, if we need to cut me off at any point, please let me know. I don't want to cut into your time too much.
You're fine, Caroline.
Okay. So for wastewater treatment facilities, I know there have been a lot of questions about owning versus operating. So again, good to start with this instruction box where it kind of goes into that a little bit. There's also a note up here. And the note up here is important to think about. So when you're inputting for both wastewater and water supply, if you're getting data on electricity and natural gas, you want to make sure that that's not double counted with your buildings and facilities. So, for example, if your government owns if your government owns a wastewater treatment plant and they include that electricity in their buildings and facilities, you wouldn't want to report it again under the wastewater calculator in ClearPath or on this tab. You can always put it in as information only, so it doesn't actually add to your inventory in ClearPath, but you still have that record so you know what is going on. And again, we'll go over that more later, but just wanted to call that out as something to start thinking about. And yeah, it's pretty similar to all the other tabs. You have emissions from grid electricity that I just was talking about, same with stationary fuel combustion. The more complicated pieces on this tab are going to be combustion of digester gas. So there are two different methods, and you'll select the method that you're going to use based on the data that you receive. So if you only receive the population that the wastewater facility serves, you'll use this population-based method and enter the data as as described here. And same with site-specific. If you get site-specific data, which I think is less common, you would input that here. And then I think Mary's kind of covered that if wastewater is optional, if you don't own or operate a wastewater facility, if you can get the data for the wastewater that your local government uses, that's good to input, but it is optional scope 3 data. And yeah, all of the calculators, just like all the other tabs, just scroll down and you'll find, if your wastewater facility flares natural gas, the nitrification, denitrification calculator, all of that. Any questions on wastewater treatment facilities? Oh, there was one. Yes, okay. So is wastewater for population, meaning people or accounts? That is going to be people. If they're looking for accounts in any of the data request sheets, it should say accounts instead of population. But that's a good question because it can be confusing. Um, and then we don't have to account for our hauling of biosolids. So this accounting for the hauling of biosolids, that would depend on whether you own and operate the facility that treats those biosolids and processes them. And then you would kind of treat it the way you treat wastewater in general. So if you own and operate it, you record that. If you don't, that is optional to record. Are there any other questions on wastewater? Okay, I'm gonna move on to water. So this is really, why does it look weird? There we go. So water is really the same as wastewater. Again, you just want to make it's really just from grid electricity and fuel combustion, so natural gas or electricity used to process or move potable water around your community. So again, you really don't want to double count for that if your buildings and facilities sector already accounted for that.
Okay, so my sewer pumps would go into the wastewater side of calculations. But I don't have a water treatment plant per se, so I wouldn't be doing this calculation.
Correct. And pump stations, they could be, let's see, I'm trying to think through that. They could go under your water supply tab and calculator, or they could be considered a facility. And so you would input that electricity or natural gas data under the buildings and facilities tab. I think that is up to what's most useful for your community to understand, and where maybe you already collect that data. Like if the electricity from a pump station is included with all of your other electricity records, it may make sense to keep it with those.
Okay, we'll do that. Thank you.
Right. Okay, we're almost done. So let's keep going. We have solid waste. I think this is probably the most confusing tab. So please come to office hours about this one, since I'm already quite over on time. But the big things to know are similar to what wastewater and water. If you don't own or operate a solid waste facility, technically it is scope 3 and it is optional to report, but we highly recommend reporting it. And so you would include that information in here. And these instructions do tell you which of the boxes to fill out, depending on whether or not you own or do not own your landfill. The one you would most likely, the one that really everyone should be using is this waste generation one. And I just put in an example here. You would put the facility name, the tons of waste landfilled, and if you don't own or operate, you may have to calculate this based on number of employees versus total population that the facility serves. We can talk more about that later. And then, yeah, that one's pretty straightforward, I think. The rest of these I find to get more confusing, to be honest. The next two, so the one after waste generation and this government owned operated, are only going to be if your government owns or operates a landfill. I think that's maybe one of you communities. So reach out to me and Mary and Kayla, if you have any questions on those. We have another section here where it's combustion of solid waste. There are two different options. So similar to that wastewater tab, you'll select and enter the data in the one based on the methodology you'll be using. So, and that really depends on the data that you're able to get. And then the rest of these, you will fill out based on, I think based on the population scaled down if you don't own it, or if you own it, you'll just be killing them out like normal. If you have composting facilities are at the bottom, and so you can input that data here. There were a couple questions on this. Oh yes, so there is a question on, does mulch making count as compost? I think it might depend on where you get the compost. Like say your local government is taking all of the yard waste from your parks and making it into mulch. That, yes, I would consider that compost because you own and operate that activity. Any other
So-
questions? Oh, sorry.
So I'm sorry. So when they wood chip everything and then use the wood chips to line the dog park, that's. Yeah, like we don't necessarily throw out or send away all of anything wood, especially Christmas trees, because they smell pretty, gets chipped and then, reused in, some of the garden beds and or at our dog park to, make it not muddy.
Yeah, the wood chipping is interesting. I might need to double check with our tech lead on that one. Because it's
And now they've
being
started
processed.
milling the big trees that fall down and using the wood for the community garden, so.
Yeah. I do think that the fuel used in like a wood chipper or the electricity used in a facility that does that should be included. But the actual like tonnage of material, I'm less sure about because it's not being processed as compost, if that makes sense. Let me double check on that one.
Okay.
Any other waste questions? I'm sure they will come up as you're going through this sheet.
When it says for compost, it's either food waste or green waste. Is green waste like yard trimmings and stuff?
Yeah, I thought I put a note of that. I did not. Yes, so bio waste is going to be food waste, and then green waste is your yard trimmings and all of that. Yeah. I thought I saw that somewhere, but it answered that somewhere. I'm not seeing it on here, but if you're not sure of things like that, ClearPath does, when you're filling out this information in ClearPath, it will explain the difference between those. So some items you can wait to fill out, like waste type, until you're working in ClearPath and have a better sense of the information that the calculator is looking for.
And I guess I just have one more question on that, Caroline. In thinking about it as, we're looking at municipal functions, not community functions. Just to clarify, if you're talking about the green waste, right? You're not talking about the green waste that is picked up by the city from residential homes throughout the community. You don't count. Do you count that or not? Like on Wednesdays, we pick up residential green waste from homes. It's a government operation, but it's produced by each household. So I'm just like, that doesn't get counted in this, or it does?
So if you own and operate the compost facility, you would include all of that.
Or just green waste? Like we're not doing bio waste composting here, so we don't have. But on on certain day a week, you can put out leaves and yard waste, and the city picks that up. I guess I'll have to find out where they take that, if we're milling all that ourselves and using it internally, or if we're shipping that somewhere. But we're counting that by tonnage as well as whatever equipment is used to process that.
Yeah. So the emissions from the vehicles that are picking that up and that type of side of that activity would be included. The tonnage, I think, depends on where it's going exactly. So if you own wherever that tonnage is going, then it would be included as compost.
Okay,
But if you don't own that facility, only what the government produces would be counted, but it would be scope 3 optional. Is that?
yeah. That's helpful.
That lost me.
Yeah. There are so many nuances to all of this. So, and I know every community is different. So please come to us with those questions because they might be slightly different for all of you. And we are prepared for that.
Love your office hours. Just know that.
Good. Any other questions on solid waste? Okay, our last tab is very quick. So this is just electric power production. So if your community owns any electricity power facility, that would go in this tab.
Good.
And they,
Yeah.
Some can forms.
Sure.
Thank you.
Oh, hey, Vicky, I think you're not on mute. Just if you could mute yourself, that'd be great.
Sure.
yeah, so I think this is pretty uncommon. I don't know if any of you even need to worry about this, but your facility, I would assume they should be calculating their own emissions. So you would just directly input whatever emissions they've already calculated into this tab. And that part would be required, but this emissions from electric power transmission and distribution losses, similar to all of the other tabs that include that, that's optional scope 3.
Caroline, just to clarify, when you say emissions, you mean the kilowatt hours, right?
So this one actually is just, yeah, this one's pretty uncommon because it's assuming that your production facility is calculating its own emissions. So if your facility hasn't done that yet, maybe reach out to us and we can walk through how to do that. That's something that I can definitely go over. Yeah. Are there any communities with electric power production facilities? So this would be like a natural gas plant that produces electricity, or a coal plant, that sort of thing.
Not to my knowledge.
Yeah, great. So hopefully none of you have to even worry about this tab.
You don't count your solar panels in that one?
No, because they don't produce any emissions.
Ah, okay.
Yeah. So again, weave that into your storytelling piece of your inventory report. That's all that I have, unless there are any additional questions on all of this. I know it was a lot and I'm way over time, so I do apologize.
Thank you so much, Caroline. And Liz, I loved your plug for our office hours. Please come to office hours on Tuesday if you have more questions, or even if you just want to listen in. We highly encourage it. All right, well, I will take over then. I'm going to do a quick run through of some questions that have come up. Caroline did a fantastic job of really getting into detail on a bunch of these. So there will be some that I might just breeze over because we've already covered them, but hopefully some others will be helpful for you. All right, so I will share my screen here. Okay. Okay. So 10 question and answers. Again, I'll just breeze through these, but they have come up, so just want to make sure we cover them. Why did we choose 2019 as a baseline year? And I'm really writing these out for the purposes of those who can't make this meeting and who might want to review this report afterward. So I apologize, these are quite wordy slides. But basically 2019 was the most recent pre-pandemic year. And because COVID has disrupted many municipal operations, that data from the COVID era does not accurately reflect or may not accurately reflect the municipality's greenhouse gas emissions from day-to-day operations. Also, choosing a year farther back, like 2019, may make it easier for you all to achieve Climate Smart Communities points for emissions reductions under the performance PE action. So question number 2, can I get data electronically from my utility? What about fuel deliveries? So HVRC, as you all probably know, has requested the data from Central Hudson on your behalf. I just want to do a quick shout out to Brian Finn, who is most of your representatives from Central Hudson. He has been fantastic, incredibly helpful, and has provided the 2019 data free of charge. If you do have online accounts where data can be downloaded, we highly suggest doing that, either setting up the account, or if it's an option, or if you already have it set up, then to achieve, excuse me, to obtain your data that way. Most utilities and fuel companies can provide the most recent 2 or 3 years of data for electricity or natural gas, but sometimes they'll charge a fee. So just to keep in mind. Question 3, do I need to have this data by month, or is it okay to have it aggregated by year? So actually, the breakdown on a monthly basis is not required for Climate Smart Communities, nor is it required from the LGO protocol, the greenhouse gas emissions protocol for government operations. However, it is ideal for decision making. It will take into consideration seasonality. It will allow you to prioritize by least efficient buildings, for instance, on a monthly basis, differing departmental budgets, for instance, and it gives you a better snapshot for the building's energy usage. So if you can report by month, that is ideal. And again, if anyone has any questions on any of these, please feel free to just chime in. Question 4, will the ClearPath tool calculate renewables used by the municipality, such as rooftop solar? We already discussed that. I think Caroline answered it, but just to keep in mind, the inventory calculates only energy use from government operations as a baseline. It's the climate action plan, which will follow the inventory, that will itemize the municipality's progress towards emission savings, such as from rooftop solar. And I bring this up because I think most communities did not have rooftop solar in 2019. So therefore it wouldn't be relevant, but it will come up in the CAP, in the climate action plan process. And also important to note that even rooftop solar and the renewable energy credits that you achieve from rooftop solar may not be considered in the climate action plan as greenhouse gas reductions. So just to follow up on that, so community distributed generation, CDG, it's a term that you may hear a lot, and it's not that helpful in terms of this reductions exercise. So in other words, even if you had solar credits in 2019, these green power credits, or again, renewable energy certificates, they're sometimes called RECs, they'll not be considered in the CAP as greenhouse gas reductions. And the reason here is because it would constitute double counting. So the renewable energy portion of a utility's power supply is already accounting for the GHG emissions factor for the region in which the electricity is generated. So that's where that community solar, the emissions reductions from the community solar, will be incorporated. So the CSC program encourages you to include information about these green power purchases in the inventory report, but they should not be included in the greenhouse gas calculations. So just a little more color on that topic that may be interesting for you. Question 6, Energy Star Portfolio Manager. Some of you have already benchmarked municipal buildings through the Energy Star Portfolio Manager. That's an EPA tool. And the question is, how does this GHG inventory differ? So the Portfolio Manager only accounts for buildings over 1,000 square feet. So what that does is it helps benchmark buildings against similar building types, and that comes into play for the Energy Star ratings in particular. So smaller facilities like, well, streetlights, pump stations, vehicle fuel usage, and small sheds are not included, but they are obviously important for this exercise that we're doing, the greenhouse gas inventory, for all government or community emissions. The good news is that the portfolio manager data can be exported and used for the inventory. So if any of you have completed this benchmarking exercise through the Clean Energy Communities Program, please let us know. We can help you download that information and use it for this exercise. So you'll just need to ensure that additional accounts not included in Portfolio Manager are included in your greenhouse gas inventory. Next question, refrigerant leakage. So should we address refrigerant leakage even if we don't have a large scale HVAC system or an ice rink? So you are not required to include small scale refrigerants. However, it is important to address the topic of refrigerants in your greenhouse gas inventory report. Even if you have only small scale HVAC systems. And the reason is that the hydrofluorocarbons produced by these systems, by heat pumps, for instance, are powerful greenhouse gases. So it's important that that's recognized, even if you're not accounting for it in the actual emissions. However, you can choose to include refrigerants in the emissions data if you want. And there are several ways to do that. You can find, in some cases, the data on refrigerant leakage on the back of your heat pumps, or you could reach out to your HVAC maintenance resources. When they do recharges on equipment, in other words, add more refrigerant, they may track the refrigerant type and amount. And lastly, the mentioned refrigerants should probably be included in the building sector, even though that it may not be, the refrigerants may not just be linked to building energy usage. So it's in a way somewhat like green concrete in that sense that there's not a perfect place to put it, but probably the sector that makes the most sense is in the building sector section. All right. Question 8, do I need to include wastewater treatment facility emissions in our greenhouse gas inventories? I believe Caroline covered this, but basically all municipal owned and operated water and wastewater facilities should be included. And in the case where there's shared ownership, I know that's the case in several municipalities, you should include an account for the percentage of ownership. If you don't own or operate the wastewater treatment facility, you don't have to include these emissions. Question 9, solid waste emissions. Again, Caroline did a great job covering this. But if your municipality owns or operates a waste facility or has a landfill within its borders, you should include these emissions. If not, the emissions are considered scope 3, and you do not have to include these emissions, although, as Caroline mentioned, it is encouraged. From a CSC perspective, it is considered best practice to include them. There are various methods for calculating this. Caroline mentioned this, but one method is to try and obtain the overall number of municipal waste. The overall number of amount of waste for your municipality, and then to scale it down based on the percentage of government employees in the community. And so the good news on this front is that I am working, I believe most of you, if not all of you, use the Dutchess County incinerator or facility. And so I am working with the county to try and get the overall number for 2019 and to get the breakdown by municipality. So if I can get that, then at least you won't have to worry about that part of the solid waste component or section, and we can work with you to try and scale that number down based on the percent of municipal employees. And last one, do I need to break out the fleet by department or to break out emissions by building? This really depends on your municipality strategy and goals for tracking, managing, and reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So while the more granular data is not required by either CSC or by the protocol, it is considered best practice. And that is because it gives you a more refined snapshot, as we've discussed earlier. You can break out the data by individual building or by individual department, and that will allow you to track more effectively over time. So that's it for me. I'm actually going to hand it back over to Kale now, who is going to talk about climate communications.
Amazing Q&A, Mary. Thanks for tracking all that. Anyone on the line have some follow-up questions for Mary? Great. Cool. Well, we'll spend not a ton of time right now, maybe 10 to 12, upwards of 15 minutes to talk a little bit about communicating your greenhouse gas inventory. We'll have more on communications throughout CAPI, especially when we get into the climate action planning. That's where, you know, communications is really key. But for today, some of you on the line are going to be thinking about how to, you know, visualize the data that you're working on gathering, how to kind of position the greenhouse gas inventory as part of a full climate action plan, use it almost like an engagement tool or a starting place with your mayors or your other leaders and community members. So it's worthwhile to have a moment to think about communications right here. So I'll go ahead and share my screen and we'll walk through a few of these concepts for today. All right. Great. So this is a familiar line as we've been talking, that the inventory is the first chapter in a bigger climate story for your communities. This is perhaps a little bit of a review, but it's important to call out the distinction between science communications and climate communications or climate and sustainability. At its core, science communication is meant to educate, raise awareness, build understanding, etc. While climate communications has some sort of action you're wanting people to do. So persuading, going back to like high school English, that's a function of communicating on climate. And that's simply because, sure, climate has a lot of science, built into it. But we're in a climate emergency. It's not just knowing that climate change is happening, it's that we have to do something about it. So that's a core function of the inventory itself. You're relaying some data, but it has a purpose. So always keeping that end in mind of what are you going to do with these results? And having that at the forefront may even inform how you group types of data, how granular you get in the details for what you're reporting. Are you going to report by individual car and truck in the fleet, by an entire department's fleet, just report a single number for all heavy trucks in the whole community? All of that kind of aggregation, you can run through a filter of like, what's the end goal for how we're going to use that data, and that's going to help you answer some of that. So here with the inventory all the way through climate planning, and when you get to be doing projects and everything else, there's a communications equation that you can keep in mind. One is to really be firm on your goal and your objective with your communications. So let's just keep that real, tightly thinking about the greenhouse gas inventory. And you all and your teams determine, what's the objective of the final report. That'll include your audience. Is this report for your fleet manager? Is it for the community at large? Is it for your task force? Is it for DEC? It's probably for a lot of different people, and you'll need to structure, the language, the report, the visuals to serve those different audiences, how they need to find the info, what they want to see. You'll develop a unique value proposition. This is an action-oriented document is all that means. How you're going to distribute the news. Is it on social media? If so, is it like a personal account versus using your city or town's account? That's not available to all of us everywhere. And then the facts are kind of just built into the greenhouse gas inventory. You're gathering the facts right now. But taken all together, those different components make for good communications. Good meaning all these things. They're effective, they're interesting, they may be funny, but they're definitely thought-provoking, and in the case of climate, can be life-changing. So who your audience is, you'll know your audience. When we talk about this, it's like varies by location, thinking about the level of engagement. Are you speaking to people, or are you writing this inventory report for people who are doubtful of climate? Are they like highly educated, maybe already? It could be a more technical audience. All to say, you know best, you know your stakeholders, you know who's going to read this or ask you questions about it. So write this for them. We've got at ICLEI, we've got a couple of guides actually. This one's interesting, I think, from a few years back. We worked with an organization that does like polling and surveys across the United States. It's called Eco America, that nonprofit. But what they were asking is like people's preferences or how they respond to different ways of phrasing things. So what that research came out with was like a turn of a phrase, or like what's a better way to say, in this example, renewable energy. It turned out that those who responded to the survey felt better or understood better using the word local energy, locally made, homegrown energy. Of course, that's only true if it is true, if the solar, the solar power is coming from, within the county or something like this. But you might incorporate that kind of language somewhere. Instead of good for the economy, attracting new business, or good for local business, maybe even refer to specific local businesses if it is relevant. Good for the country, good for the people of Rhinebeck, good for our neighborhood, or something like this. All of those things, scored better, for lack of a better term. And this guidebook we have has a long list, like several pages, I think, of these types of examples. So we'll send that around. When you get to creating your greenhouse gas inventory report, and kind of all the way here at data collection, it's good to get together in your group and like have a little huddle and talk about the goals, and making sure that your goals are SMART goals. What's the specific aim of your communications angle for the inventory? Can you measure that? Like, is it, total number of people that are going to read your report? Some maybe like funding, like a dollar amount of funding you want to get from EPA or elsewhere. I know we'll talk more about these opportunities coming up in a few weeks and months. That the goals are attainable, that you can track them. That's really important. Who's going to track them, and relevant, and then, time bound. Will it happen over the next month, next year, etc. You all are very goal oriented, so that's not anything new. Another question to ask yourself around the communications is it a passive or an active goal? Increasing awareness generally is a passive goal. It's hard to track. it doesn't require maybe a ton of follow-up beyond your key deliverable, like the greenhouse gas inventory report. You're kind of just going to release things to the world, and whatever happens, happens. And that's where a lot of us are. That, you know, due to capacity, that is a good goal. You know, is like we have this kind of passive dissemination, and that's great. Where you can, you might want to also have more active goals, and that's like tracking the number of readers of this report. Sometimes you can set up on your website a link tracker that allows you to know how many people click on it, or downloads, or something like this. So that's active versus passive. And then how will you adapt your communication strategy over time? All to say, flexibility is key in your reporting. Great. I'll spend just a few minutes here. I know we got to wrap up this segment in within probably 5 minutes, but we've talked a lot about data on a spreadsheet today. Thank you, Caroline. That was amazing of an overview. But you can see very numbers heavy. Numbers entered into an Excel file, into fields. That's not an easy way for your end audience to interpret the data. If you're like me, it's not even easy here on the back end to be doing that kind of stuff. And so ultimately, you'll have a set of visualizations, a way to visually show this data. This one we see on the screen is the most common way. This comes right out of ClearPath. I think probably any city in the United States that's made a greenhouse gas inventory has a pie chart that is showing the general breakdown of sectors and total emissions. A way to kind of move a step beyond is to like turn this into a little bit more of like a infographic style. This is super simple. This was Christchurch. I think that's in Australia, but they just like obviously took some clip art and put that around the edge. And right away that you can share that around on social media or something, and it's a little bit more visual. There's some online tools out there, free websites that let you create this kind of visual. I'll share those free websites with you. But just recognizing that the transportation sector is not one thing. It's like those leaf blowers, and it's the heavy trucks, it's the fire department, the police department, etc. So you might do a little extra ring around the edge and give yourself a bit of a refined pie chart that way. This community, I'm blanking on which community this was, but they had, kind of just a way to show multiple pie charts instead of everything included into one, breaking it out sector by sector in this kind of format. Very simple. It's not a lot of extra steps to do this kind of more advanced pie chart. This view here is also what we see time and time again. I'm not saying any of these are bad. I just want to show you the starting point and then where you can build from. This is the type of visual that you'll get right out of ClearPath. So by all means, use these visuals. The tool will let you download it directly as an image file, showing, in this case, change in emissions over time, because you can see it's like 2008 to 2016. You all are doing inventories for a single year. So that it's not, this is not exactly the kind of visual you'll have showing change. Don't get hung up on that part too much, but there are these like bar graphs that you'll use, similar, concept here. Here is an example from Ulster County, taking these bar graphs, pie chart, bar graph, taking the bar graph right out of ClearPath, and they had 2 years of data. So they're just showing some changes. It's very easy to see what's happening here. One thing I like that Ulster County did is they qualify or paint a picture around what the total emissions, like grand totals equal. So it's like that 1,104 metric tons, like that would mean nothing to anyone. Even me, you know, I've been working at ICLEI for 6.5 years, and I don't have a good sense of like, is 10,000 metric tons a lot? And so this really helps break it down. It's equal to 1,000 homes using electricity for a year, rail cars worth of coal. So no matter what, please work with us or find examples of how to like characterize the total values of the emissions in a relatable way. And we got all kinds of examples that we can pull. Ulster County does a really good job of showing where their inventory fits in a bigger climate action story. They made this whole process and it's so, you know, I mean, you don't have to be so technical, I guess, or step by step, but just showing like, you know, our community is developing a climate plan. Here's what we intend to do with it, etc. And like even a timeline could work really well, where like you are here, and that's the inventory. Inventory complete. We've got a full, you know, game plan in place for where to go in the future. This example is out of New Paltz. A little like texty in their report, but even still did a good job of showing their emissions, like how many trees would it take, you know, to lower all of these emissions? How many solar panels would we need to put on roofs to lower this quantity of emissions? So gearing up a reader to think about solutions, you know, right away. That may be an approach that works for you all. Infographics are wonderful. We don't see them as much as we could probably in a greenhouse gas inventory report, but there's a lot of free tools online that can easily, with some clip art like this, you know, turn your executive summary or your final like overview into a shareable infographic. So I really encourage you to do that. This one's out of Somerville, Massachusetts, a little bit busier, but you can still see all the sectors are represented on one page. I like when I see these kinds of things. This one's more solutions oriented or climate action plan oriented of what the city of Adelaide's going to do. But I like a snapshot of a town, and then you can show where the emissions are coming from. So just like a different type of infographic there. This example is from Holland, Michigan. I think I shared it real early on. Their entire sustainability plan, which includes climate, is just one long infographic. So if you go to, I think it's hollandsustainabilityreport.org, you just scroll through a long page with these really like pretty graphics, and that's their whole report, not like almost no text. Really fun, and I think somewhat simple, I guess, to put together to kind of lead with the visuals. So I'll end here so we can go into breakout rooms, but want to share that there are these free data visualizers, even ones like this D3 on the right, where you uploaded your spreadsheet and it tells you which visuals lend itself to the way your data is structured. So it makes it really easy and fun. Here's 3 websites that have all the infographic templates you could ever want. These are free too. So just to let you know, you're not alone, but if you're on the communications side of this project, it's good to go ahead and get started like choosing some of your options now, and helping your data team as they collect and condition, as we say, as they clean up the data, to get it in a format that makes it easy to do the visualization at the end. Cool. I will stop there. We can have a few questions, and then I think it's breakout time.
Can you put up this slide with the graphics one more time, please?
Yeah.
'Cause, you know, I'm sitting here trying to write it when I should have just taken a picture of it.
No, all good. We'll send these around.
No,
like,
the
right
one
away.
where you can get it for free. I like that one.
Yeah, these are free and these are free.
That one. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. I think we're good, Mary.
All right, so breakout room time. I'm going to place you in breakout rooms by municipality. So in the first breakout room, I'm going to put those of you from the city of Poughkeepsie, town of Poughkeepsie, and Dutchess County, and I'll be in that breakout room. The second one will be the town of Pleasant Valley, town of Rhinebeck, and the village of Rhinebeck, and Kale will be in that breakout room. And the third will be the city of Beacon, town of Amenia. And I'm also, Liz, going to put you in that breakout room as well. So, and anyone else, I think there are a few from HVRC. So other stragglers in that room as well. We'll have 15 minutes. And the idea here is to first get to know each other better. And hopefully you guys can share ideas on what you've done to date, what's working, what's not working, what roadblocks you've encountered, how have you worked through those, or you're working through those roadblocks. Maybe you want to talk about what stands out as something surprising you've learned so far. These are all just prompts. You don't have to cover all of them, but if they spark some ideas, feel free to use them. So how have you worked together as a team? How is everyone communicating? Are you having issues communicating with the municipal staff or the volunteers? And is there something that's worked well to facilitate communication that you want to share with the group? How do you think this work may be impactful? And to what extent do you think this work will be understood or appreciated by the municipal staff, by the community? And what do you think could help on that front? And lastly, if you want to talk about what you want to get out of this work or what you are getting out of it, that might be interesting for everyone too. But feel free to also ignore all of those and talk about what you think would be most useful. And I will give you a 3-minute warning. And then we'll come back together and I'll cover next steps and homework. So with that, I will send you to your rooms. And hopefully this will work.
I wrote this whole email about how these meetings keep lining up right before a day before our planning board meetings. So it's been a little bit of a challenge, but we actually started reaching out to some of the staff here to collect some data internally. So we're still at the beginning stages, honestly.
Mhm.
Kristen,
Yeah,
I should mention, sorry, just a quick note on that front, and I'll mention this to the big group as well, but if you ever can't make a meeting or it's bad timing, you can always join the Westchester CAPI cohort meetings. And I can give you more details on those. I believe they meet on the first Thursday of every month. So, Liz is from Westchester, but she's joining this cohort because she can't make the Westchester meeting. So just an idea.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I would we're City of Poughkeepsie is also in the beginning stages of collecting our data. We just kind of had a conversation where we sat down with folks within DPW and facilities to talk about data resources. I mean, I honestly think the biggest challenge is going to be record keeping, and that many of these records were not adequately kept even in 2019 to now, so in terms of where I think we're going to end up, where there's going to be a lot of work on the ground, is like figuring out the numbers we do have, where we do have them, how to either, project those so that we can kind of get 2019 information, or fill in gaps in data, like it's not so much of finding the person to talk to. I don't feel like for the city, I feel like for the city, a lot of it is just going to be, well, that information wasn't properly tracked in 2019. I don't know. That's where just some of them, in terms of, I think a lot of maybe the factors that we were going over earlier in terms of like, so we'll get a whole number for our waste, and how do we, there's been zero tracking of government facility waste versus our community waste from what I can tell, so I just think that's the biggest challenge that I'm coming up with, and keeping my intern from getting super overwhelmed, is that like all the data might not be there. We just have to pull what we have, and then from there filling gaps. But I don't know if any other communities are facing that right now as well.
I think Dutchess is going to be in a similar boat. We have a meeting scheduled next week to go through all of the solid waste data with our Deputy Commissioner of Solid Waste, and I don't really know what to expect. We do keep pretty good data and a lot of, because we have so many reporting requirements, but I don't know if it's broken down, municipal, or if we're tracking the waste that the county produces versus the other waste that's collected and processed through the Resource Recovery Agency. So it'll be interesting to see what her feedback is. We're also planning to meet with, as we were preparing to reach out to DPW, we realized that the ask is quite large, because almost everything comes through our DPW, whether it's our fleet or our facilities management, even our sheriff's vehicles and all of that are coordinated through DPW. So we realized pretty quickly it needs to be a sit-down meeting where we really kind of break all of these asks out individually, and we are assigned the right person to speak with, because it can be overwhelming. But I'm confident, I'm hopeful that the data exists. It's just trying to get our hands on it. A lot of the county departments, they run like machines, and they're used to just doing whatever they normally do. And so this is kind of a wrench in the gears, if you will, getting people who are already strapped in terms of their capacity to stop what they're doing, and carve out time to to dig into records, and get them in a certain format for us. So it's going to take some strategizing to make sure that this is seen as a priority for those employees to get us the data. But I spoke with Mary, and it seems like we have a good chunk of time to actually get the data back from them. I think she had said we've got like a month or two before before we really need to have this data analyzed and tracked. So hopefully, if they understand we're not asking for this data tomorrow, it'll help them not feel overwhelmed.
Yeah, just on that point, Devin, and thank you for sharing that. It is an option to not break your buildings down by department or by address, or figure out the address for each one of the buildings or account numbers, and do that at a later date, right? Like, as I mentioned in my Q&A, really CSC and the protocol requires only an annual number. So if that's all you can provide at this point, you can start with that, and then at a later date, go through that quite exhaustive list of accounts from Central Hudson and figure out each one of those accounts, right? Like who's in that building, or is it a building or a pump station or a park, and what department works there, and if there's any part of that building that may be leased out, is that the case? I mean, I think that's, in my mind, been one of the biggest challenges, is who has really that overview of all the facilities in a municipality, right? Like, is it someone in the finance department who really understands like each one of these accounts and what it's tied to, or is it someone in DPW, or is there no one who really has that sort of more holistic view of the facilities? So yeah, it's challenging work. Do you feel, Natalie, like that there are people for the city of Poughkeepsie who can help you with that, like in a sort of more bird's eye view?
No, not really.
Is there someone in finance maybe who, I mean, I don't know to what extent.
Everybody has little pieces, right? So finance has a little bit of the fleet stuff because they need that for accounting. DPW has the gas usage for fleet stuff. DPW, I think similar to what Devin said, like DPW is the main person for a lot of these numbers. I might be able to get the pump station information from engineering who watches that more closely, but a lot of it's in DPW, and there is no one person in DPW who has like an overarching view. I think that, I mean, and I don't mean to say this like if that is what we get out of this process for the city of Poughkeepsie, is that we are identifying where we are not tracking data properly and where we need to improve on that, then that's movement forward enough for me, to be honest, you know. So like, I don't necessarily mean that, I don't mean to say that as if like, because we can't get all this data, that it's not going to be a worthy process. Like, I just think we maybe are starting at a different point than some other communities, and our goals and our tracking are just going to look a little bit different because of that.
Yeah, I would probably jump in on that. I mean, even just something as, I mean, it's pretty robust, not to minimize the amount of work that went into it, but like we worked on a fleet inventory, started that process in 2019, and even just to collect information on what vehicles and how many we have. By the time I got all of the documentation in one place, there were vehicles that were already being swapped out, but I had to like find that out and pick it back up. I mean, it took probably 18 months just to get a list of like 120 vehicles in one place and all tracked. And then it was like, okay, well, we're going to track the progress of that change. Whose shoulders is that falling on? And I'm like, well, I guess me. Like, I don't think so, but but yeah, it's I can totally attest to that feeling of sort of like feeling like you're pulling from the comptroller's office and every sort of department head, and while they already all have their own responsibilities day to day, as do I and Mike, and you know. And thankfully we have some great volunteers, but yeah, I kind of agree with that sentiment at this point. But really for us right now, the challenge has been timing and just trying to set it myself as sort of being the lead, setting aside the time to really be able to then even go to those people educated enough to ask for the data that we're actually looking for. So we're getting there, but.
Yeah, those are, I mean, I just will echo, that's been my experience as well, both in my municipality in Hastings and just talking with others. And I mean, I think that is a huge part of the value of this process is setting up processes to make this process easier moving forward. So whether it's coming up with a committee who will yearly meet and go through the inventory, make sure it's up to date, and give suggestions on how to either replace vehicles or to retire them. You know, that's, I think, a really worthwhile effort. I know that's helped a lot in Hastings. We did pass a green fleet policy, and part of that was in the resolution, it's mandated that this committee has to meet at least once a year, and it has to review the inventory, and it has to update it, and it has to consider if they're vehicles, again, that should be retired or replaced. So, you know, it takes a long time, and but hopefully this process will be easier the next time around.
It was just fascinating to me that we didn't even have that data in one place coming into it. I was like, oh, sure, every department totally just has a spreadsheet somewhere saved, right? Tracking what they have, and no.
The other thing we're going to have to figure out is there are some joint facilities. I know you mentioned that in the discussion, but you know, we have the joint city and town water board, right, and plant, and we're going to have to allocate, I guess, percentages to each municipality. Same on wastewater. I mean, there's 3 different wastewater treatment plants in the town, so, and some are jointly operated, and so we're going to have to work our way through all of that as well.
Mike, let's get because I was just talking to Rich DePilka in engineering about that, and he felt like he had pretty good estimates for the city town shared one in terms of 2/3, 1/3 split of usage there. So, and stuff like that. So I haven't scheduled the conversation with him, but I'll let you know when I do, if that might be helpful for you to jump in, or I can report back.
Yeah, no, we'll definitely, that would be helpful. Yeah, thank you.
Natalie, how's it working out with John and having an intern? Is that helpful?
We haven't really dug into getting him to do too much right now. So I yes, it'll be helpful, but I still think I'm going to end up doing a lot of I tried to set him up to have conversations with commissioners and in DBW and stuff, but he's just not going to get the same response that I'm going to get if I'm the one hounding them to get this information. So hopefully he can be more instrumental in the data manipulation and entering portion. But right now for the collecting, I don't think it's really fair to try and put a lot of that on them. It's going to fall to more kind of salaried staff positions to do that work. So it's still a lot on me, I think, right now, rather than John or the other 2 volunteers within the team.
Yeah. One idea that we had was if it would be helpful for us to host the employee commute survey on HVRC's website, we're happy to do that and collect the results for you and make sure that that you get those back. So just something to think about if that could simplify things for you or for any of the communities for that matter. But I know you're particularly understaffed, so I just want to make sure we can do everything we can to help. All right, 2-minute warning, or 3-minute warning here, but yeah, I don't know if anyone else has found that this process is uncovered something interesting or surprising that you didn't know about your municipality beforehand, or if something, if you feel like it's brought people together, or if there's anything that that you think will come out of this, or you hope to come out of this process.
I'll just chime in with that. One thing that I'm learning, and I don't know if this is necessarily because I myself am newer to a lot of this work taking over from Brad, or if it's the case either way, but it seems to me that a lot of the components to this CAPI project, they're spread out amongst multiple departments and they're already happening, but there's no unified, coordinated way that all of this is being filtered into one solid plan. So I think that I was surprised. I thought a lot of this was going to be building it up from the ground up, going from scratch. But it seems like a lot of the data tracking is happening in various divisions within various departments, but it's just not adding up and being reported out somewhere. So in a way, I'm a little bit relieved to think that, and this could be naive. I mean, I haven't had these meetings with DPW yet, but I think it's not going to be as bad as I originally thought. But it will be good to see once the plan is in place, what do we do moving forward? How do we keep up this coordination between our departments and between divisions within departments? Because county government is very siloed. We do partner on, interdepartment projects for certain things, but there's a lot of things that we're not doing that on. So hopefully this plan will identify ways that we can be communicating and coordinating our climate action efforts better interdepartmentally.
Thanks, Devin. And you had the last word because I'm going to close out now. We're going to head back, but thank you all. I will. Hopefully the others will join us soon. Oh, yeah. 5 seconds. All right, thank you all. I am going to quickly go over the next steps, and hopefully I can do that in 3 minutes so we can end this on time. But before I do that, I just want to do a quick shout out to everyone to say thank you again for all this great work. And I particularly want to call out the town of Pleasant Valley. I know it's been a rough road. They've had some defections and they've had some not the ideal support from some of the municipal staff. They're pretty much all volunteers. So I just want to say, they've persisted and they've moved ahead and they're making great progress. And I hope that everyone is inspired by them. I know I am. So thank you, Town of Pleasant Valley.
Well, thank you, Mary.
It's
been a little rough.
Yes, I recognize that. And I really am very inspired by your efforts. So thanks again. So just a quick review, office hours. I really highly encourage you all to come. Bring any questions or no questions, just listen. But it's a great opportunity to hear more about what's happening in the other cohort participants. SharePoint folder, make sure that you put your data into the master data workbook that Caroline went over today in your SharePoint folder. The CAPI website, if you're ever unsure about what's happening or what you should be working on, you can always look at that. It will give you your homework. It will have recordings of the meetings, as well as obviously shared resources. ClearPath, we'll be talking more about that at the next meeting, but you can start looking around if you are the main data resource. Homework for the data resources, continue to customize and send out the remaining data request. So again, not too different than last month. Ensure that all the account numbers are included in the data from Central Hudson or NYSEG. Identify the buildings, facilities, and department associated with each account, and how you'd like to group the data in a way that works best for managing emissions for your municipality. And lastly, cross-check and consolidate the data as desired. And input the data into the Excel workbook as it's received. Team homework for those who are not the data point people. So really look at some of the visual aids that Cale mentioned today. Those can be found on the resources he mentioned or in other reports that you can find through the Climate Smart Communities portal. Can you guys all please mute yourself if you haven't already? Begin to populate the greenhouse gas inventory report template with high level information. So there's a lot of information in that report template that's not specific to the data. So that's information that you can start inputting now. That's information specific to your community and to your goals. Yeah, it's important to start looking at that now so that you can strategize too if there are different infographics or visual aids you'd like to include. Continue to document and publicize this project. And then lastly, reminders. Meet once a month, keep minutes, document progress, ask questions, and always check the Dutchess CAPI website. And last but not least, please remember, please to track your time in the time tracker in SharePoint. This can go back, going back to March 15th, 2021. We will be sending a report at the end of the quarter to the DEC. So by the end of this month, we'll need a full report of all the hours in the last 3 months. So it's particularly important that if you haven't put hours in, that you do so by the end of the month. The next cohort meeting will be on Wednesday, April 19th. This will also be virtual. I hope you all can make it. And we will be talking more about ClearPath at that point, among other things. So thank you all. Have a great month and look forward to seeing you soon. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Mary.
Thanks, Mary.